Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Glad you're here. I have the privilege of introducing you tonight to our speaker, David Bernstein. So I met David a while back because I was doing some research on the political spectrum of anti-Semitism, and I just typed in on Google woke anti-Semitism. And as soon as I did, a book came up that David Bernstein wrote called Woke Antisemitism. And he had just released it. And so I ordered it. It was fantastic. And I interviewed him on my podcast. And so we wanted to have him come today and to share with us about the rise of anti-Semitism on the left and what that looks like. Next week, we'll have Tamara Berens with us from the Tikva Fund, and she'll be talking about what anti-Semitism looks like on the political right. But let me introduce David. He is passionate for the free expression of ideas. He's the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which supports viewpoint diversity, counters woke ideology in the Jewish community, and opposes novel forms of anti-Semitism emerging from woke ideology. Bernstein served as president and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, a national umbrella for local Jewish advocacy. He served as executive director of the David Project, which educated and trained American college and high school students in Israel advocacy. He also held senior roles with the American Jewish Committee, where he began as director of the Washington Regional Office and served in management roles overseeing regional offices as well as national and local programming and advocacy. Bernstein has been a leading advocate for Israel's quest for peace and security on the legislative, diplomatic, media, and intergroup relations fronts. And we're glad to have him tonight on FOI Equip. David, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much. I'm going to put up a few slides here in a second. Just thought I would say a little bit about why this is such an important and fraught moment for the American Jewish community. American Jews obviously are a diverse crowd. We're like everybody else. There are political liberals and there are political conservatives. There are Orthodox, conservative, reform. So we're not monolithic by any stretch. But I'd say the majority of American Jews have always been sort of, I would say, center-left liberals. And there's a good reason for that. Jews were very tied to the civil rights movement in the United States. It was viewed not just as a movement to liberate Black Americans, but rather Jewish Americans and other minorities as well. And that was sort of emblazoned on the Jewish imagination, that coalition between the Jewish community and people of color. And I think it created generations of Jews who felt very much connected deeply to the larger civil rights community and couldn't always see when things were going wrong. I go back, I've been in the Jewish advocacy world my entire life. And I remember years ago going to a multicultural day in Washington, D.C. I was part of a larger program, and we had multicultural day, and I was all about connecting with other ethnic and religious groups, so I was excited about it. And the guy who got up, the facilitator, was the principal of a Catholic school in Washington, got up and he said, "Racism equals prejudice plus power." What? I thought racism was animus or hatred toward another racial group. What's this thing about plus power? And I walked up to him afterwards and I said, I didn't agree with that definition. He said, well, it's not really for you to agree or disagree. That's what the definition is. And I thought, that's odd. He's not even open to discussing it. And I started to think about it, and I wrote my first article about this more than 20 years ago. I wrote an article saying, if racism equals prejudice plus power, that means that Jews are a community that is perceived as powerful. So therefore, we can't be victims of racism. And it means that communities that are perceived as powerless can't be perpetrators of racism. So where does this discourse leave us? And I thought it was highly problematic. And I warned my fellow Jews at that time, and I was just a young professional staffer at a Jewish organization, that this could come back to haunt us. I wrote another memo to my colleagues at the American Jewish Committee, where I worked at the time, that I'm starting to see disturbing signs within the Civil Rights Coalition that things were changing, that there was a new discourse afoot that divided up the world into oppressed and oppressors, very simplistically, into oppressed and oppressors, and really saw no room anywhere in between. And we were going to be viewed as oppressors because we were perceived as being white and economically successful. And so therefore we were going to be lumped in. And so I've been following the shift in the tone within my own political backyard for a long time. And it was really after the death of George Floyd and what followed that I started to think there's an ideology that's really unleashed here that's quite dangerous to the Jewish community. And you could feel the shift in attitudes that was leading to more anti-Semitism on the left. And we can talk about the differences between anti-Semitism on the left and the right and in the Muslim world, if you'd like. And I wrote my book in October 2022. And 1 year later, of course, we have October 7th. And again, before I go into the slides, one last little story. After October 7th, I was in South Florida, and I went to speak to a mainstream Jewish organization. And they're very nervous, these mainstream Jewish organizations, about my message. They don't want to alienate anybody. They don't want to alienate anybody on the left. They don't want to alienate their traditional civil rights partners. And they're worried that my message criticizing this ideology will do that. So the guy who I know for a long time, good friend, great guy, introduces me. He's the director of the office there, introduces me, and he says, David's about to say some things that are a bit controversial. What a way to be introduced. Hi, thank you for not doing that. And you know, and you might, but hear him out. It's an important conversation to be had. I gave my spiel, I gave my talk, and after my 20 minutes or so, we started going around the table. It was in this law room, this law firm conference room, and we got to the one person that everybody was most worried about. It was this very progressive law partner, high-powered person who'd been very involved in social justice left-wing causes. And everybody's agreeing with me, much to the surprise. And we get to the one person we're not sure about. And that person says, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know where I fit into American society anymore. They were so shocked. The people that they thought they were their friends who had abandoned them. Some of the people that they thought they were friends were denying the idea that Israeli women were raped on October 7th. They couldn't believe that those are the people that they thought they were allies with were saying the most horrible things. And we're justifying this mass murder. And I think it's been a real wake-up call for American Jews. And I still think many of us are still trying to make sense of it. You know, I was listening to a friend of mine who is a really top Middle Eastern analyst, and he was talking about the intelligence failure that Israel suffered on October 7th. You had these young Israeli women soldiers on the front line who had been monitoring and warning everybody that there was going to be an attack that no one listened to. And they said it was just this tremendous intelligence failure. And I feel like American Jews had an intelligence failure of our own. That we weren't paying attention to the signs. We didn't understand this radical left-wing ideology, and we didn't understand how it affected us, and we were in denial. And so when it actually hit after October 7th, in the way that you've seen in these protests across the country, on college campuses, in high schools, and other institutions, they were not prepared mentally because they didn't have a clear picture of what was going on. In Israel, in Hebrew, the name for that sort of group think that they were suffering is called the conceptia. It's this idea that they had a conception that Hamas would never attack Israel, that Hamas didn't want a war with Israel. That was the conceptia. Well, American Jews had our own conceptia, and that conceptia was that anti-Semitism was primarily a threat that came from the right. Yes, there was anti-Semitism on the left, but it was not a big threat, and we could manage it. And that was where they were wrong, was an intelligence failure. So let me dig in there a little bit. I'm going to share my screen here. And you can all see that, I presume. I want to start out by defining what it is that I'm talking about. What is this ideology? And the most simplistic way of talking about it is it's an oppressed versus oppressor ideology. It's an ideology that says there are two classes of people in the world. There are people who are the oppressors and there are people who are the oppressed. If you're white, you're an oppressor. If you're a man, you're an oppressor. If you're black or brown, you're oppressed. If you're a woman, you're oppressed. If you're heterosexual, you're an oppressor. If you're homosexual, you're oppressed, so on and so forth. It fixes identity to either privilege or oppression. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean by that. I want you to look at this slide here. It's called the intersectionality wheel of privilege. This is used in diversity, equity, and inclusion programs around the United States. You'll find different versions that look almost the same. So in the center is power, okay, as you can see there. And right around there are, if you're white, if you're salaried, if you're a citizen, these are things that give you power, okay? You're Christian, you're able-bodied, and the like. You go one rung outside of this, you're never married, you're a manual laborer, you're you're middle class, you have less power. Then you go one rung out of there, and it's I would like to blow this up a little bit more if I can. Let me see if I can. You're visibly black or brown, your body size, your gender, your sexuality. Those things give you less power. So all those things are fixed to power or privileged or oppression. So if you're any of the things on the outer rungs, you're high on the oppression scale. If you're any of those things in the inner rungs, you're part of the powerful, privileged, and so forth. That's how this ideology works. And you can imagine when you're a group like the American Jewish community that's perceived as being one of the most successful communities, even if we have a history of oppression, even if we suffer more hate crimes than any other community by far, and we do, that's the FBI statistics show that by far Jews are the most targeted community by hate crimes. It doesn't matter because we're mapped into this power structure at the very center of power. That's where we fit in. And because so many of us didn't understand it, we didn't really know where the anti-Semitism was coming from. So let me I'm sorry, I'll shrink this a little bit so you can see it. I like to think of it sorry, 1 second. I like to think of it as an iceberg, okay? There's sort of the part of the iceberg that's above the waterline. That's where you see anti-Semitism. That's where you see these raucous protests on college campuses yelling all kinds of things above the waterline. But what a lot of people didn't understand in the Jewish world is that there was a whole reality below the waterline. This was an ideology that first was introduced in our universities in the late 1960s. You can call it postmodern theory. It's this idea that knowledge is not something that we actually know, but knowledge is something that's produced by the powerful people in society to keep themselves powerful. And that they embed knowledge in discourses in the way that we talk about things in order to perpetuate their power. And that leads to sort of what you might call social justice ideology or woke ideology, which divides up the world into the powerful and the powerless. And you see things like cancel culture, for example, because if you're somebody who's part of the powerful, what right do you have to talk about your position on racism? You don't. You're powerful. You're just trying to perpetuate your own power. And so that becomes the source of cancel culture. And it's really just above the waterline that we see anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, and anti-Semitism. And I think for the Jewish community especially, and for its friends, we've got to start fighting this phenomenon, not just above the waterline, not just what manifests itself, but below the waterline, the ideologies that produce this anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second. I'm going to go back because I want to, there's a little 1 minute video that I want to share here. I'm sorry, wait, one more time. There's a 1 minute video that I'd like to share, see if it works, that illustrates my point about looking at it below the waterline. So let's see if this works and if it.
Some of the high schools that didn't walk out spent their lunches phone banking Congress. Over at the Columbia School of Social Work, students were holding a sit-in in solidarity with Palestine.
Yesterday, we held a 9-hour sit-in at the School of Social Work where we were threatened with sanctions. And today, we're here because it is part of the Shut It Down for Palestine movement that's happening all across the world today. And we are here because we are going to do a die-in. Currently, the School of Social Work uses a prop framework, which is power, race, oppression, and privilege, where we learn about decolonizing social work, which we think is hypocritical when we are being silenced on Palestine, which is a colonized place.
All right. I assume you all heard that. Ty, did they hear? You all heard it? Okay. So a lot of time I've shown this video to a few Jewish groups, right? And they noticed the die-in, they noticed these protesters, they noticed this young woman in a keffiyeh here, and they're looking above the waterline. But what they fail sometimes to see, and what I'm trying to get people to understand, is that she was talking about this sort of prop program, right? I mean, I could go to that. Here, let me see if I can get to that little part toward the end.
Is hypocritical when we are being silenced on Palestine, which is a...
Right. I went a little too far up there, but what she was talking about is her own social work program. She's a social work student at Columbia University. And in her social work program, she's being learned to decolonize social work. Now, what in the world does it mean to decolonize social work? I think we all know what it means to decolonize India, right? We know what it means to decolonize a country that was formerly a colony. What does it mean to decolonize social work? What she is saying is that my entire field is colonized. It's colonized by what she would call white supremacy. Okay, this idea that that the white culture is dictating who's how we should treat people in society. And she's saying, so I'm going to decolonize that. What does that mean? She's going to teach her clients not to adapt to our system so that they can lead more productive lives, which is what social work traditionally did. It helped people along, groups along that were facing obstacles to adjust to society. But rather, she's going to teach them to recognize the systems of oppression that they're under in society and to resist that oppression. That's what her entire field is turning into, is decolonizing social work. So she's taking that lens of oppressed versus the oppressor here, and she's applying it to her own field and to her own university. And she's saying, my university is a hypocrite because when I tried to then go and protest Palestine, which is colonized, you didn't live up to your own values. So you see what's happening here is that we've basically educated a generation, our elite universities have educated a generation of college students and graduate students to see the world in this way, and they're then applying this simplistically to everything in life, but also to Israel and the Palestinian issue. So I'll show you some examples of how this manifests. Few years ago, one of the first times I really saw this, really play out. At Stanford University, there was a student. He was a student governor, a student senator. And the student senator said publicly that he didn't think it was anti-Semitic to say that Jews controlled the banking industry or media or what have you. And he was brought up on charges before the Stanford Senate and asked to resign. But what was interesting about that is what took place in the hearing. Everybody went up there and took turns condemning this student who perpetuated these anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories. But here's a quote that you heard at that time. Some stress the importance of understanding the intersection of white privilege and Jewish privilege before voting on the resolution. In other words, they were able to call this one student who engaged in blatant anti-Semitic tropes an anti-Semite, but then repeated it in their own social justice language. The intersection of white privilege and Jewish privilege. So you see how this discourse plays out on campuses. So one of the ways this also manifests is it insists that Jews are white, and because they're white, they're powerful. Okay, so this is my colleague Pamela Peresky. Jews who have never been seen as white by those for whom being white is a moral good are now seen as white by those for whom whiteness is an unmitigated evil. So when being white was considered good earlier in American history, Jews were considered other. But now that being white is a moral evil, Jews are considered white. And so that's another manifestation of what we're seeing. Here's another. This is a quote by Whoopi Goldberg. I think it's to get an understanding of how this discourse plays out. So she's talking about the Holocaust here. Well, this is white people doing it to white people. So you're all going to fight amongst yourselves. If you're going to do this, then let's be truthful because the Holocaust isn't about race. It's about man's inhumanity to man. In other words, she had this view of racism, that racism could only be committed by people that she thought were white against people who are not white. And in her view, Jews were white, and they must have been white in the eyes of Nazi Germany as well. But of course, that's not true. The Nazis had completely racialized the Jews. They saw the Jews as an inferior race, a very dangerous race, and had to be exterminated. So she's applying this American view of racism to something that happened, decades ago in Nazi Germany, and you can see how it really gets you off track. Here's a quote that I really like from Andrew Sullivan, who's a writer, thinker. If you replace the word whiteness with Jewishness, this kind of demonizing rhetoric could be straight from the Nazi textbook. It identifies a racial group. It attaches evil characteristics to it. It ascribes those characteristics to individuals within the group, and it sees their success as one at the direct expense of others. The logic of anti-whiteness and anti-Semitism blur over time into the same thing. So what Andrew's warning is that what we're seeing, this sort of anti-white idea as well that's caught on, actually it sounds very much like anti-Semitism. And it's applied in this way, you can see how when it's applied to a vulnerable group like Jews, it becomes even more dangerous. I want to show you something else. This is from my own kids' school system in Montgomery County, Maryland, in suburban Washington area. The schools adopted a diversity program called the White Supremacy Culture Framework. And what does that say? White supremacy culture tells you that if you show up, the idea, the norm of showing up to school or work on time is a white supremacy value, and that we shouldn't impose those kind of norms in society. So I want to show you this is an actual slide from this pedagogy in my kids' school. Okay, you can see the picture here of these men with their tiki torches. Now, as you might recall, they're marching around where, anybody know? I mean, you don't have to say it. I know a lot of you are muted. A synagogue. They're marching around a synagogue and they're yelling, you probably remember, Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Okay, these are neo-Nazis, right? So this is what they're teaching their teachers and they're teaching their kids at Montgomery County Public Schools. Being honest with ourselves, did we look at this image and think, that's not me, or I am not that kind of white person? Or not all white people are like those white people? Do we want to view ourselves as good white people and distance ourselves from bad white folks? How does this good-bad binary get in the way of accepting that we are all participants and reinforcers of a system of white supremacy? So this ideology, this white supremacy framework, makes no distinction at all between the neo-Nazis who were marching around a synagogue and the people who were cowering in that synagogue who would be perceived as white as well. They're both guilty because they're both white. And that's being taught to our teachers in a school system that's 10% Jewish. And I can tell you, I've raised this problem with Jewish teachers in the school system. They said we tried to push back against it, but we were told that this is the way it's going to be, and the people who did push back were targeted by the school system. This isn't like this liberal, compassionate school district in Montgomery County, Maryland, and that's the new ideology. That's the new pedagogy. All right. Another manifestation of this is sometimes comes in a form of the term equity. Now, we all know equality, the idea that we all have the equality of opportunity in society. But equity is this idea that anytime that there's a group that is not achieving on average as the same as other groups, then it must be discrimination. So the highest goal of society is to get every group at the same level. When I see racial disparities, I see racism. In Kendi's view, racial inequity is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. So in other words, if there are 13% Black folks in society, there must be 13% Black scientists, and if there's not 13% Black scientists, it means that there's discrimination against Black people in science, period. No other explanation. The flip side of that is if you're a group that is overrepresented in the sciences, in the laws, in medicine, in business, then you must have gotten there by riding on the wave of white supremacy. And it puts groups like Jews immediately in suspicion, because how else did you get your place in society? Another source of anti-Semitism. This is from the Black conservative economist Glenn Loury, who I think really gets it right here. One consequence of a fixation on group disparities, understood to be the necessary consequence of oppression or racism, is that groups that do well will come under suspicion. Their success will be thought to be the flip side of the disadvantage of the groups that do poorly. If African Americans are underrepresented in this or that venue because of systemic racism, and Jews, let's say, overrepresented in that very same venue, how can it be otherwise but that the overrepresentation of the Jews is somehow the bitter fruit, the necessary consequence of that very system of repression that excludes African Americans? It strikes me that it does feel resentment and envy and a kind of antipathy that can easily express itself in violence. I think I think I could go deeper, but maybe that'll be enough for the slides here. This is a different kind of anti-Semitism, and it also plays itself out, of course, in the way that Americans are understanding Israel, particularly younger Americans. I'll tell you, when in May of 2021, when I first started my organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, there was a conflict between Israel and Hamas, and I had been an active veteran in previous conflicts, not literally a veteran, but I had been following them closely. And I would always analyze the media coverage. And so in 2008, during Israel's first conflict with Hamas in Gaza, and then in 2014, and then in 18. So I was used to the sort of trajectory of the conflict, and it was very predictable. In the first few days, the mainstream media would always say, Israel has the right to defend itself against rocket fire or tunnels or whatever was going on at the time. And of course it does. Within 2 or 3 days after the Israelis were fighting back and striking back at Hamas, and the death toll began to rise among Palestinians, they would immediately say, that's enough. This is disproportionate force. Israel should stop defending itself, stop fighting back against this threat. And, within a few days, the conflict would be over because Israel would then be under pressure by whatever US administration was in power. That was not the same in May 2021. In May 2021, Israel got no leeway at all to fight back. It was understood by many that Israel was the oppressor and that the Palestinians were the oppressed. Israel's the white guy and Palestinians are the brown people. That's how it was understood at that time. And you could really feel the difference and see the difference in that way that conflict played out. And I think we're really seeing that even more so now in the wake of October 7th. Israel might have been given a couple days because the attacks of October 7th were so horrendous, but it didn't take long at all for people to insist that Israel stop defending itself and allow Hamas to survive after, it cut short the conflict. So why don't I stop there? Is it okay if we do Q&A? How do you want to handle that?
Yeah, we can go to Q&A. If you have questions for David, put those in the chat box and then I will present them. David, I'll kick us off here because I've got a couple. So to your point of what you were just talking about, Israel in this paradigm of critical theory is viewed as the white colonial oppressor, and we hear that on college campuses all the time. The breakdown there is that they're neither colonialist nor white. In fact, probably a good portion of our viewership today, they have been to Israel. And if you go to Israel, you notice as soon as you get there, at least, okay, I should say I do, I'm often in the melanin minority. There are brown people, black people, all of which are Arabs, Jews. That doesn't seem to matter to those espousing this. Do you think are they aware and ignoring it, or they're just ignorant when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's always a good question. By the way, my mom is from Baghdad, Iraq. I'm, according to 23andMe, 50.4% Western Asian. And so by the definition of the people who like to classify everybody into a race, I'm Western Asian and not white. But it doesn't really matter to them. They've already made a decision that Israel's white. They're not interested in the particulars. They're interested in sort of this seamless intersectional worldview where all the groups that are perceived as oppressed are supporting each other. Now, they have created a very simplistic view of history, a false view of history that, Israel stole the land from the indigenous people and kept it all for themselves and dispossessed the Palestinians. And so anything that Israel does is automatically a sin. There's no self-defense. The colonized and the oppressed always have the right to defend themselves. They can do no wrong, and Israel can do no right. So that's what you end up with when what is that old commercial? This is your brain on woke. I think that's what it does. It's a grand simplification of the world, and you can't really argue with it.
It certainly is a problem when facts don't matter, and we're seeing that. So again, please send in questions. I want to ask one other one. I see some coming in. One of the things that boggles the minds of people more in our camp in evangelicalism, which is usually politically conservative, is that some of the Jewish community, a minority, I think, are joining these protests against Israel. And it seems, I would assume, kind of drinking the Kool-Aid of wokeism. Can you explain to us what's happening maybe in the minds of those organizational leaders that even though they are the ones being targeted as Jewish people, that they are somehow siding with the pro-Palestinian, largely pro-Hamas protests?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say that it is really a small minority of people. It's a loud minority of people, but it is a small minority of people. We have all kinds of survey data, and the vast majority of American Jews support Israel. Overwhelming majority, like in the 90% majority. And so there is a small percentage, tends more young, but not only young people, who have been sort of radicalized more generally by the ideological conditions on campus. Some of them were brought up in very liberal homes and went, far more extreme than their parents had ever raised them. Their parents might have been bleeding heart liberals, but they were patriots, right? They were liberal patriots. These are people, their kids have sort of jumped ship on that and become much more radical than their parents had ever imagined, I believe. And you see that. But it's a small minority. These are people who believe that some of them, by the way, are very actively Jewish. They may be involved in their own synagogues. There are rabbis who are anti-Zionist rabbis, and they believe that Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, is somehow a distortion of what it means to be a Jew. And I think that they yearn for a kind of like socialist Judaism that you saw in the, around the late 19th, early 20th century that was popular. And they want that back. They want that version of Judaism back. And they're trying to live that out. I think that I try to ignore them as much as possible, not to spend too much time thinking about them or obsessing about them. It's very easy. A lot of people in the Jewish community ask that question that you just did, Ty, and I think really obsessed about that. And I'm like, if you spend too much time worrying about that small percentage of people, we're not really doing all that we need to do to really energize the vast majority of people who agree with us. So but they're definitely growing in numbers, not, and they're hard to completely ignore.
So David, I have a couple of questions related to media. So maybe we'll just ask it this way, particularly with young people. And I don't mean the people we were talking about just now, the Jewish young people, but people in general who are on campuses protesting and are on social media, espousing this woke anti-Semitism. What role do you think the media has played, whether that's social media, mainstream media, in forming or being a catalyst for these negative ideas as it concerns anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Well, social media is a complex phenomenon, right? It's not like there's somebody who controls it all. What it does do is it allows fringe groups to organize more easily and to talk to each other, and it allows a level of groupthink that I don't think we saw before. So, I think social media helps smaller groups become larger and organize more effectively than they would otherwise.
Mhm.
The mainstream media in America, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know. Trends liberal, and it's become more liberal in the past decade or so for a variety of economic factors. Moving away from the advertising model to the subscription model, media now has to appeal to its sort of core audience. And so if it's a liberal media outlet like the New York Times, it's now doubling down on appealing to that one constituency so it gets the most possible subscribers rather than a broader swath of the public. So it might have always been liberal, but it's more so now. And I think that plays a role in all of this as well. I don't think that mainstream media outlets are necessarily supportive of everything that goes on. I don't think the average reporter at the New York Times is hostile, but I think that they're probably more sympathetic toward the Palestinian narrative than the Israeli narrative, and they're less likely to want to perceive what happens on college campuses as being anti-Semitic. And they tend to want to equivocate on everything. So to draw analogies between, what's happening to Muslim students to what's happening to Jewish students. And so they tend to dumb down the story. They tend to ignore acts of hostility. I can tell you that when I tried to get mainstream media outlets to cover what's happening in a lot of K through 12 schools, where you see real extremist teachers and educators take over school systems and introduce curricula that I think are shocking. And tried to get the mainstream outlets to cover it, it's very hard to do so. They don't want to believe that story. It goes against the grain of their narrative. So I think that there is bias there, and that does play a role in society not understanding really what's happening and downplaying the threats.
So I have a question from Ben. He says, can you speak on the presence of anti-Semitism in Congress? Could there be stronger legislation on the state and federal levels? I'm assuming as it concerns combating some of this woke anti-Semitism.
Yeah. I don't know that we can legislate ourselves out of this, quite honestly. I think Congress has a role. And I've really only begun to understand it. Congress has a role. Having the hearings, there were some hearings today, but the hearings and dragging those university presidents in and questioning them about their own toleration of anti-Semitism, I think is a very powerful tool. When we've seen, let's say, the Department of Education fund really radical groups in California and provide them money to develop curricula that is explicitly anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And then we tell Congress about it, and then they investigate and they put the screws on at the Department of Education. That's a good thing. So Congress, in my view, has a role to play, but it's not necessarily in legislating this. I'm a free speecher myself. I believe in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. I think free speech serves us well. I do believe that people have a right to express hateful sentiments. And I don't want Congress or anybody else to sort of legislate that away. But what happens in a lot of these universities is not free speech, it crosses over into conduct. So when you prevent the movement of a Jewish student, or you physically accost a Jewish student, or you prevent them from going to classes because you've taken over a quote unquote liberated zone, that's not just free speech, that's conduct now. So what I want us to do, on the one hand, is preserve free speech. And I know, by the way, that the universities in the United States that are dead last on free speech are also the places that are most hostile to Jewish life. Who are the dead last universities when it comes to free speech? Harvard and Penn are dead last. And they're also among the most hostile places to be Jewish on campus today. So I don't want to end free speech. I want to enhance free speech. I want universities to go back to being places that foster free speech, but they're not. And so that's the problem. They're oftentimes like to profess their free speech values when it comes to anti-Israel conduct and protests, and then but then apply a completely different standard when it comes to others. And that is a problem.
Yeah. Well, Churchill said something to the effect of everybody loves free speech until they hear that you have an opinion different than their own. He was much more eloquent in how he said it, but there are still some questions coming in, but maybe this is a good jumping off point to ask you about this, because at least in the demographic you're speaking to, again, more of a political lean to the right, the term liberal is seen with, it's viewed through a not particularly good lens, but you use liberal in a couple of different senses. You're talking about it in a political sense, the more left, but your own organization has liberal in the title. So talk about the distinction between those two uses of the term.
Yeah. Classical liberalism is the idea that society should be built on the rule of law and on the free expression of ideas and on a democratic governance and the like. Those are classical liberal values. So when I use the term liberal values, that's what I'm talking about. In the United States in particular, the word liberal has been conflated with political leftism. That's not the case, by the way, in a lot of other countries. In the UK, a liberal is a conservative. In Australia, it's a moderate. So, this term is a confusing term. In fact, it's confusing. It might not be confusing only among, Christian conservatives. It's also confusing among some Jews who are also skeptical of liberalism and tell me why I don't want to support your liberal organization, and I have to explain to them what we actually stand for. And we may even change the organization's name because of that level of confusion.
Sure. You're advocating the good kind of liberalism, the old liberalism. We had a question here, and I don't know if you can comment on it or not, relating to Congress and it's HR 6090, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2023. Any thoughts on that? I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, it enshrines the definition of anti-Semitism put forth by the IHRA. Thoughts on that bill and that definition?
Yeah. And so there's this definition, it's called the IHRA definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's been around a few years and it's been a source of controversy. I think it's a perfectly legitimate definition of anti-Semitism. What it does is it cites several examples of where anti-Israelism crosses into anti-Semitism. So it says that if you're demonizing Israel, you're using like Nazi imagery, then that's a form of anti-Semitism. It says that if you're denying Israel's right to exist, and only Israel's right to exist, that can be a form of anti-Semitism. And if you're applying double standards, moral double standards, you're treating Israel different than you would any other country, that can be a form of anti-Semitism. Now, the IHRA definition is not meant to be used as a way of saying, oh, you violated the law because you demonized Israel. That, first of all, that would never pass constitutional muster. What it was meant to do is it says, if you're, let's say, a government that's monitoring anti-Semitism, it's not enough that you just monitor the very explicit kinds of anti-Semitism that we all recognize, the imagery that we all recognize. You also have to look a little deeper than that. And it may be that some of the anti-Zionist activities that you didn't treat as anti-Semitism are actually a form of anti-Semitism. The other thing that the definition is meant to do is to be applied in certain kinds of discrimination cases or hate crimes cases. So, for example, if a professor at a university is being if there's a claim against him for being anti-Semitic against and mistreating his Jewish students, the IRA definition would allow you to introduce evidence about some of, let's say, his Facebook posts, which might have been, which might have said Israel is a Nazi country, and you could say, doesn't that lend credence to the idea that he's motivated by a kind of animus to the Jewish people? So that's the way you're supposed to use the IRA definition. And in those situations, I think it's perfectly legitimate. Again, I don't personally think we're going to legislate ourselves out of this. But I do think in certain instances, you can see what's going on at Columbia University, for example. I mean, there are going to be so many what are called Title VI claims. Title VI claims are anti-discrimination claims against the university for its unequal treatment of Jewish students. Just today, I believe, it might have been yesterday, there was a news article in the Free Beacon that came out that the top administrators of Columbia were at an event where they were talking about the problem of anti-Semitism in Columbia, and they were talking about how to support their Jewish students. And while the event was going on, they were texting each other saying that this is a bunch of BS, what's happening, what they're saying about anti-Semitism. You should read the piece. I mean, that is going to be introduced as evidence now in a Title VI claim. Somebody smart in the audience took pictures of the phones of these administrators who and that was introduced in the reporting. So anyway, that's what I think the IRA definition should do. And I think it's perfectly acceptable to do it, but I also don't want us to lose sight of the bigger battle, which I think is about trying to push back against this radical ideology.
Yeah. Well, David, one more question, not seeing any others come in right now, is you mentioned in your talk that the American Jewish community, at least, is viewed as successful. And certainly in the climate that we're living in this woke paradigm, at least, being successful or having some alleged privilege, it's viewed as a negative. It used to be viewed as a positive. And so when you look at the Jewish community, a lot of us would look at that as an immigrant success story of Jewish people fleeing persecution, coming here, thriving. So I want to ask you this: in the current climate, what are you seeing in the Jewish community as in terms of responses to those claims? Do you see, and maybe this is kind of a binary, but do you see it more as Jewish people kind of shrinking or downplaying the success aspect of it? Or do you see people embracing it and saying, we have been successful in the American system and you can too, or somewhere in between? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not enough of the latter and too much of the former. I think Jews desperately want to be viewed as many Jews, not all obviously, as an oppressed group. We want to take our place in the matrix. It makes us feel safer there. I've been arguing against that, and I think there are a lot of other people who realize now that it's a no-win situation, and that as long as this ideology dominates, we're not going to be on the winning end of it. And anyway, we shouldn't be on the winning end. It's a damaging ideology for the rest of society. It's illiberal. But I think too many of us want to be viewed that way. I do think you're absolutely right that we should go back to seeing it. Your entire line of questioning to me and my answer would be viewed as something called model minority theory. Again, this is I'm illustrating how this larger ideology is applied. Asians are often called also if they depict themselves as being, we're a successful minority, it's viewed as a kind of anti-blackness. It's a subtle way of saying, well, we're successful and those other brown people aren't successful. And so that deters Jews and others from talking about their own success in this country. They came, we used to tell stories like this all the time. My grandfather came to this country He went through Ellis Island. He had nothing but the shirt on his back. He got, he was a peddler. Then he went into business with a few friends, and then they bought a store, and now they're successful. And those stories were told all the time, and as a source of pride. But this ideology makes that very hard to do, and I think a lot of people have stopped doing it because it accentuates their perceived privilege, rather than being seen as the product of a successful community making its way on the American scene.
Sure. One final question. I said that was my final. This is my real final.
There's another question that I saw, Ty, about what we should do about all this too.
That's what I wanted to come to. Yes.
Yeah,
So Kathleen asks, how do you push
Yes.
back against that radical ideology? If it's not legislation, and I think as Christians, our own theology would agree with that's not where the ultimate source is going to come for victory over these things. But very practically, what can people do? What can evangelical Christians do to push back against this ideology?
So the first thing I think we need to do is be courageous and speak up against it. And it is not easy to do for a lot of people. It's not easy to go into your school and say, we think that this diversity, equity, inclusion program that you're doing is teaching our kids to hate each other, and that's bad. Because they're being told that it's used to help people identify racism and their privilege. And so we're trying to get people to be courageous. I like to say that I didn't understand this when I first started doing this work, but we're in the courage business. How do you get people who have been sort of cowed into silence to speak out and to organize and the like? I think there's more of that after October 7th than there was before. More people see and understand the problem, and they're starting to speak out. But it is hard. Moderates don't like to speak out. Moderates don't want to get dirty. There's this old saying, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig likes it. And so when people start accusing you of being privileged or racist or whatever for sharing a different opinion, it's easy for you to just clam up. And what happens when you do that? Well, the pig wins because you don't want to get dirty. And then the only people you hear from are the pig because no one wants to get dirty. I think we got to get moderate people who, care about others, who, from the center right to the center left. I like to say from the 30-yard line to the 30-yard line of society, to start to speak up for those common values. And to me, that takes courage now to speak, to go against somebody who's willing to call you names. This is the most censorious time in American history, more censorious than the McCarthy era was in the United States. We have survey data on that going back decades. Americans are walking on eggshells now more than they ever have because they don't want to be called names. They don't want to be accused of something. And so they just clam up and they don't talk to each other. And I think thoughtful, moderate people have to start talking to each other in thoughtful and moderate ways. And in ways that, that love thy neighbor. I think that's the absolute key to overcoming these ideological forces over time. I mean, look, there's other specific things. Universities are a major source of this, and I think we have to fight back against universities and get them to return to their original mission of pursuing the truth and through inquiry and education. I mean, that's what universities used to do. Maybe they were never perfect, but I can tell you that they changed a lot since my time in the university. And if they're teaching a whole generation of young people to hate their country, if they're teaching a generation of young people to think in terms of oppressors, they're teaching them what to think rather than how to think, then I think this country is going to be locked into this current ideological moment. I think we've got to fight back in universities. I think Board of Trustees members and donors of universities have to start doing more to insist that the universities live up to their own stated values. I think that they too often, wanted to toe the party line. They like the university president. They want to move up the ranks on their Board of Trustees. They want their name in bright lights or whatever it is. And they put up with a lot of this nonsense for too long. So we got to get them to push back against their own universities and say enough is enough. We're not going to teach. I don't want to be a part of you if this is how you're going to teach the next generation.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that I think we can do to push back. I think a lot of it is building a new coalition of thoughtful people who are pushing back against radical ideology and anti-Semitism, no matter where it comes from. You know, and I hope that's you know, and by the way, I just want to say, I can't tell you how much it means to us to have supporters in the Christian community. I mean, many of us feel very lonely after October 7th. Very lonely. Our kids feel insecure at college. Our kids feel insecure at K through 12 education. People we thought our friends turned out very often not to be our friends. And it means so much to know that there are people who are standing up for the people of Israel right now who aren't morally confused. And we just can't express our appreciation enough.
Well, it's our privilege, David, and we're so thankful for what you're doing and everyone's doing there at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Those of you attending tonight, I want to encourage you, if this intrigues you, and hopefully it does, because it's something that every friend of the Jewish people, friend of Israel, needs to take seriously, then I want to encourage you to do two things. First of all, go online and order David's book. It's very good. He lays out the framework for much of what he's talking about tonight and goes even deeper on some of these topics. Highly recommend that. And that is called Woke Antisemitism, How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. Its foreword is by Nathan Sharansky, who is a Commentary magazine calls him the greatest living Jewish hero. Just a remarkable man, and he endorses this. It's a remarkable book. Second thing, go to the website for the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. That's JILV.org, and you can find out more about the work that David and his colleagues are doing to combat some of these bad ideas that have gotten into the system, and maybe you throw some support their way. David, I want to thank you again for coming and speaking to our group tonight, and thanks again for all you do.
Appreciate it very much. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right.
Before you all go, I just want to say, David, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. You had me the entire time watching. Can I just say this? Everybody take a deep breath, because we're talking, you know, David, this is we mostly do Bible studies here, and we teach about the importance of Israel and the Jewish people. And so now we're entering into the realm of the politic, and the politic can make people get a little, you know, antsy inside and jittery. You know, their hands might start shaking like this or whatever. So maybe a lot of you agreed with what David said. Well, next week, we're going to the other side of the aisle. That's right. Can you believe it? We're going to the other side of the aisle. So take a deep breath. Let me tell you something really quick. After October 7th, my eyes were opened to actually the anti-Semitism of the Christian right wing that maybe you're not familiar with, but I see it on here, and maybe even David sees it. Not too long ago, there was a movement called, and you probably as Christians would love this phrase, you've sang about it, Christ is King. Well, you know what? There were Christians going on Twitter or X, what it's called now, and they were hashtagging Christ is King as an anti-Semitic trope to the Jewish people after October 7th. They were using our Savior's name to put down the Jewish people and Israel's right to defend itself. And I was absolutely shocked, and it hasn't stopped. So that's why we need to be aware of it. So when you come back next week, I want you to come prepared. That's right. Maybe you're on the more conservative side of things. We've got to understand where the anti-Semitism is not only on the progressive left, as we heard today, but also on the extreme right wing, so that we can speak into it as Christians when we get to our local churches on Sunday. So come back next week, come with an open mind and an open heart to learn, and I can't wait to see everybody. God bless.